Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special tour with the Friends of the Boston Harborwalk. Normally, the Friends of the Boston Harborwalk does a cruise every winter, and they show people the harbor from a boat. And Mike Manning, who's the chair of the group, jokes that he made a deal with the devil at some point in time because there's always beautiful weather, even though it's in the dead of winter. And somehow he's done the same thing this year. We have a beautiful night to take you around the harbor walk. This evening, though, we're joining you via Zoom, thanks to local precautions and wanting to make sure that people can attend and be safe in the middle of COVID. We're really grateful that so many of you could join us this evening. I assume that most of you have used Zoom before, but in case you haven't, I want to go over just a couple things to know tonight before we get started. If you're on a computer, you can scroll your mouse over the screen and you'll see the options for both chat and Q&A. Feel free to say hi in the chat, tell us where you're calling in from. And as our presenters begin, feel free to use the Q&A function to ask them specific questions. I'll be back with you at the end of the evening to moderate those questions. I should have introduced myself. My name is Alice Brown, and I'm the Chief of Planning and Policy at Boston Harbor Now. One of the favorite parts of my job is that I get to be a liaison to the Friends of the Boston Harbor Walk. They're an all-volunteer group that does three major things. One of those things is provide tours, normally walking tours in person along different sections of the harbor walk. But for the last year, they've pivoted, they're online, they've got monthly Zooms. And at the end of this, I'll put a link in the chat so you can watch previous harbor walk web tours. The second thing they do is really incredible research on history all around the harbor walk. And they've been installing interpretive signs. And I'll give you a link for that as well. So you can go check out some of the signs either online or in person. They do a great job interpreting the history and showing the complexity of it all over the Boston shoreline. And the third piece of work that they do are harbor cleanups. So they both work with contractors who remove large debris from the harbor and organize volunteer events so that you can do cleanups right along the water's edge. Again, I'll be providing you with more information about all of those things at the end, but I really want to get started with this phenomenal tour. Tonight, you'll be hearing from 6 of the volunteers, and we're going to start out with Sarah in Charlestown.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Sarah Rich, a 20-year resident of Charlestown, and I joined the Friends in 2015. Tonight, we're going to move in a counterclockwise direction around the harbor, and I'm going to start at the northernmost segment of the harbor walk, Charlestown's mystic shoreline from Sullivan Square to the Navy Yard, and we'll discuss land making and development that has taken place over the years. Today, 2/3 of this coastline lies within the Mystic designated port area and is therefore not publicly accessible. You'll see in the upcoming plans for Harbor Walk improvements along the inside boundary of the DPA. The early explorers recognized the valuable features of this land of 5 hills along the Missituck River. Charlestown, known as Mishawum, or Great Spring to the Wampanoags, its freshwater spring and its strategic location at the confluence of 2 rivers at Morton's Point. Can you see my mouse? With a view overlooking the inner harbor from Morton's Hill. For hundreds of years, the natives farmed Mishawum's mystic shore, shellfished and trapped alewife and herring, which to this day swim upstream to spawn in the fresh water of the Mystic. They also gathered clay from its banks for pottery. The colonial settlement was clustered around Town Hill, today's City Square, located in close proximity to the freshwater spring, and branched out along today's Main Street. The Mystic side of Bunker Hill remained undeveloped, with the exception of farmland and some military fortifications and a perimeter stone wall. Some still refer to the area around Berry Playground as the Point and Sullivan Square as the Neck. Charlestown was once a peninsula connected to the mainland by an isthmus, a narrow spit of land with the Neck to its north, Tidal Flats to its west, the Mystic to its east, and the Charles to its south, separating it from the mainland. For context, this map shows the original formation of land at the arrival of the first settlers versus today's land mass. Here's a map showing today's streets. It's no coincidence that we have flooding in the areas of low-lying land during extreme tides. There were 3 tidal mills powered by the tidal flow of water. Tufts Mill at Morton's Point, which is today's Berry Playground, and 2 dams at the Neck. On the Mystic side, in the location of today's Ryan Playground, was another Tufts Mill, previously called Cutter's Mill, and the mill on the west, which existed as early as 1649. A distillery, brewery, pottery, and tannery emerged around the mill in this area of today's Sullivan Square, but there is not much development on the Mystic until the 1840s. In 1803, construction began at Charlestown's Neck on the Middlesex Canal. This 27-mile waterway allowed the trade of goods for 50 years between Lowell and Charlestown. It was later extended south along a towpath, enabling barges to reach Boston Harbor, extending commerce to Boston and beyond with its growing network of trade ships. This land would later be infilled as railroads became the common way to convey goods. In this map dated 1818, we start to see the farmland along the Mystic broken into long lots which stretched from Bunker Hill Street to the coast. Medford Street doesn't exist yet. Today, there is still evidence of the original bulkhead on the inside of Medford Street, which was the coastline at that time. From the 1840s to 1890s, multiple wharfs and piers were constructed on the beginning, I'm sorry, excuse me. From 1840 to the 1890s, multiple wharfs and piers were constructed on the east side of the Neck to support the growth of trade and mercantile shipping. Look how the wharfing out and expansion of Mystic Pier has occurred in these 4 maps, dated 1848, 1854, 1879, and 1890. In the late 1800s, we saw dramatic infilling of land along Medford Street as the rail network expanded, terminating at Mystic Pier. Between 1879 and the early 1900s, Mystic Pier was created by constructing granite seawalls around the perimeter of an existing sandbar, and grew to become a major commercial epicenter as competing railroads needed to reach it. Here's the original seawall. As the railroad network expanded, Medford Street was developed into a, I gotta back up. The Little Mystic Channel was an existing body of water known as South Channel. I'm gonna go back to this slide to show you the South Channel, and was required by law to remain navigable. It was dredged and a seawall was constructed, allowing additional docking for commercial trade ships. Here's a scene of the Mystic River, the Little Mystic Channel around 1890. As the railroad network expanded, Medford Street developed into a mercantile strip of lumber yards, potteries, wool and cotton storehouses, bakeries, sugar refineries, a candy factory, and a popular swimming beach amidst them, which was replaced by the Domino Sugar Refinery in the early 60s. In the 1970s, Massport constructed Moran Terminal on Mystic Pier, the region's largest container shipping depot, until the late 80s when Connolly Terminal took over that role. Moran then became the designated vehicle import-export processing terminal. Today, the outer port is surrounded by a 40-foot deep channel, enabling access by large ships. The outer port receives primarily cars Subarus from Japan, and used vehicles are also exported from here mainly to West Africa. The Mystic DPA is also home to a wind turbine blade testing facility, a boat manufacturing company, the region's largest recycling facility, a concrete plant, a giant pile of salt, and until recently, a brewery and gypsum plant. Adjacent to it are recreational fields, a housing co-op, a residential loft building, and a bustling Asian community garden. On the north side of the DPA are Flatley's commercial office buildings, research labs, and their spectacular segment of the Harborwalk by the Shafts building. Future development plans include Massport's Park along the Little Mystic, which is right here, a mixed income housing complex, a rails to trails path, which will fill in some of the missing segments of the Harborwalk, allowing one to commute from Somerville to Boston. If you were to walk this 1.5 mile stretch, you'd cross industrial, recreational, residential, and commercial parcels. All of these uses are able to coexist harmoniously because of the political leadership, community involvement, and collaboration amongst governmental and non-profit agencies, private industry, and actively engaged citizens. This is truly an exemplary part of the Harborwalk. We're now going to move south, and I'll hand it off to Liz Nelson Weaver for our next segment.
Good evening. And welcome to the Custom House. Boston, I'm going to speak a little bit about its history, and then I'm going to tell you about the kind of public access there is to the Custom House. Boston had had a number of custom houses before this one was constructed, but in 1837, the building of this one began, and its design and construction really was meant to capture the city's prominence in international trade. At the time that this building was being planned and constructed, there were about 1,500 vessels from abroad coming into the main wharves in Boston every single year. So it was extraordinarily busy, and Boston had a key role. In fact, it continued to be the second busiest harbor in the country throughout the 1800s. So this was a statement. And it was also a statement about the success of the quite young United States at that point. It was a formidable project. It began with laborers having to install 3,000 wood pilings down to bedrock because this was being constructed on former mudflats. It took a decade to construct. Among its features, of course, are these extraordinary granite columns going all the way around. There's 32 of them. Some of them actually are structural. They support the building, and others are more decorative in purpose. Each of these columns was quarried out of a single chunk of granite. They're not pieced together in any way. Each was a single chunk, and they came from the Quincy quarries. And at the time that it was constructed, it was the most expensive federal building in the country. As you can also see, when it was built, it was right up along the waterfront, right at water's edge, a very logical place to place a custom house, right in between Long Wharf and Central Wharf, and just steps away from India Wharf, the three busiest wharves in Boston at the time. In 1913, construction began on the tower. As you can see, the tower covered that dome that we saw in the previous picture. It took just 2 years to complete. And when it was finished, it was the tallest building in Boston by far. And it remained the tallest building for the next almost 50 years, up until the Prudential Tower was built. And the reason was because it completely violated Boston's height restrictions. Boston's building regulation said that no building was supposed to be higher than 125 feet. In fact, when the tower was completed, this building stood 495 feet tall, or just shy of 4 times what the restrictions allowed. But as a federal building, they did not have to adhere to local standards. So this was our tall building in Boston for almost a half century. It was used as customs offices right up until 1986, more recent than one might imagine, at which point the city took it over for 10 years, and then they sold it to the Marriott. And the Marriott did a major transformation and turned it into one of their vacation club resorts and hotels. So, public access today. It's a somewhat little known fact that the public actually has access to the first 2 floors of this building anytime you want. Walk on in. And it's the only way you can see that original dome, because of course the tower covers it from the outside, but you can see it in all its splendor from the inside, and it really is quite beautiful, along with many other features of the building that you can see up close if you go inside. So the first and second floors are yours to explore. The other great gem about the Custom House is its observation deck on the 26th floor. It offers truly beautiful views, 360 degrees all the way around. The ones looking toward the city are a little bit blocked by some of the tall buildings, but looking out at the waterfront neighborhoods, the harbor, and out to the harbor islands is really quite extraordinary. Here you're looking at the north end. You see the Old North Church and Charlestown on the other side. Looking straight down, you're looking at Christopher Columbus Park and the North End Wharves. Here you're looking east. You have Long Wharf, Central Wharf with the New England Aquarium right on it. Across the harbor is East Boston, and slightly to the right of that, of course, would be Logan Airport. And then looking out beyond that, the harbor islands. And on a clear day, you can absolutely see them. Here you're looking slightly more to the southeast, so you're looking at Harbor Towers, the Rose Wharf complex with the Boston Harbor Hotel, and just beyond that, on the other side of the Fort Point Channel, you have the Seaport District. So beautiful views. It's open pretty much daily for a fairly limited time, like an hour or 2. And unfortunately, right now, it is not open, but keep an eye on it, give them a call. They anticipate that in the spring, it'll definitely reopen again as all our lives begin to return back toward more normal. It definitely will reopen, so keep it on your radar screen. The other fun little nugget about the Custom House is that it has a role in an amazing success story. As many of you probably know, in the 1960s, raptors had been horribly affected by DDT poisoning. And so birds like the peregrine falcon were among those affected. And there was not a single pair of peregrine falcon east of the Mississippi River during that time. Now there are 30, and 2 of them nest on the 30th floor of the Custom House Tower, just 4 floors above where the observation deck is. And you can see the couple, which return every year, by the way, the same couple. You can see them, their nest, and their young as they grow on the Massachusetts Audubon Society camcorder, which is positioned right there to take it in beautifully. These photos are actually taken at the top of Harbor Tower, where they love to perch and swoop around. On the right, you have the adult peregrine falcon, and on the left, you have a couple of the juveniles after they started to fly. But anytime you're walking around right in this area and you see a bird doing some pretty amazing swooping and gliding, there's a good chance it's one of the peregrine falcons. So you might want to carry along a small pair of binoculars and take a look at them, because it's really quite extraordinary to watch. So with that, I'll end my short bit about the Custom House and pass the baton on to Jan Engelman. Thank you.
So hello, everyone, and please bear with me while I get my slide presentation up. So I am going to introduce you to one of my favorite Harborwalk discoveries, which is Rolling Bridge Park, and it's located here in an industrial area near the end of the Fort Point Channel. It's on land that was created by the Big Dig to cover the I-90 tunnel to the airport. And it's a great place to get a sense of the industrial and transportation history of this area. So I bet you're wondering, what is this little park way in the back of Beyond doing on the Harborwalk? Well, I can explain that. This map shows the original shoreline of the shoreline of Boston at various points in time. The dark green area is the 1630 shoreline of Boston, and everything else that you're seeing would have been underwater or in the harbor at that time. So I want to draw your attention to this blue and yellow area here. This was a natural deep water channel between the town of Boston on the Shawmut Peninsula and broad tidal mudflats to the east. And over time, this became the waterway we know today as the Fort Point Channel. This happened by a series of landmaking projects on either side of the channel that are denoted on this map by the various colors. And one of those landmaking projects occurred here, and it was the development of a seawall and the creation of land to house a major new train station and rail yard. And the purpose of this project was to consolidate what were at that time 4 separate lines that came into Boston from the west and the south. And this is what we know today as South Station. Now, this consolidation required a new rail crossing here, which happens to be the location of our park. And south of that area, in this location called South Bay, was still at this point an open waterway with an active waterfront. And what this meant was the bridge had to fulfill 2 jobs. One was to get trains across the channel to the new station, and the second was to open for boat traffic. This was the bridge that was built for that purpose. Now, there's a little teeny guy there, which shows you how massive this bridge is. It's a triple leaf bridge, each leaf double track, and its massive size is one of the reasons this bridge design was chosen for the location. You would never get 3 spans so close together because on a swing stand bridge that opens horizontally, rotates around a center drum. It required bridges that open up, the general term for which is a bascule bridge. And these 3 spans can each be opened and closed independently by one operator. Another feature of the park is this counterweight here. A counterweight is basically a weight on the opposite side of the bridge span to balance it, and this allows the bridge to be opened more quickly and with less effort. And on this bridge, each of these spans is so well balanced that the span, weighing 500 tons, can be opened or closed in 30 seconds with a 50 horsepower engine. Now, William Scherzer's innovation to all of this is this curved heel here that the bridge can roll back on. Up to this point, bascule bridges pivoted on what was called a trunnion. This rolling motion allowed the bridge to open more efficiently. And this bridge design was adopted all over the United States. Its efficiency is really important in this spot because when South Station first opened, it was the busiest train station in the country, and the bridges had to open a lot. So over time, boat traffic diminished, train traffic diminished. So when the South Station was renovated in the mid-1980s, this bridge was demolished and replaced, not demolished, dismantled and replaced by another. But as I said, critically not demolished. What meant that when the Big Dig was designing the park, people clamored to have a piece of the bridge in the park, and a piece was installed. This is an actual heel from one of the leaves of the rolling lift bridge installed as close as possible to its actual location in the operating bridge. And this bridge is situated in the closed position. So the counterweight would be up here and the bridge span would go out this way. Excuse me. So this is clearly the highlight of the park, but it's not its only feature. Behind us, there is signage, including a map that shows the historic bridges of the Fort Point Channel with a little information about all of them. And if we turn around, there is a circle of granite blocks, which used to be part of the center drum of the Cove Street Bridge, which has to be the shortest lived bridge in the history of Boston. It existed between the railroad bridge and the Dorchester Ave Bridge from 1907 to 1914. It was designed to carry traffic across the channel and the tracks to the Neyland Street area of South Boston. Sorry, of Boston. But it was built much too close to the Dorchester Ave Bridge, and the two of them couldn't operate independently. So the Cove Street Bridge was removed, but not the center drum. It stayed in the channel until this park was built, allowing the granite stones to be recycled as a seating area. Although the day that I visited, these young men had repurposed it as a sparring ring. I want to point out these guys sparring in the center and this guy over here filming them so that they could critique themselves later, which I thought was fantastic. So this may not be the Harborwalk's biggest park or its most beautiful park, but in my view, if it's being used creatively like this, it's a successful park. And I encourage you to come visit it as soon as you are able. It's a great little gem. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Mark, who's going to talk about the Fan Pier.
Thank you, Jan. I'm going to be talking about Fan Pier, its creation, development, decline, and rebirth. Fan Pier is a large industrial zone built on landfill from about 1851 to 1880, and it appears right here, this little curved area on this map, which shows the time course of landfill in Boston. Even more land was filled in a little bit later than 1880, as shown here in blue. In this 1891 Bromley map of Fan Pier, you can see the layout of tracks that basically is on the Fan Pier area. It is arrayed, the tracks are arrayed near the piers and warehouses. The New York and New England Railroad was the major railroad at that time, connecting southern New York State with Hartford, Providence, and Boston. That railroad eventually was incorporated into the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. In this 1903 Walker and Company drawing of Boston Railroad terminals and freight terminals, you can see Fan Pier here in the foreground, and then you can see Fort Point Channel to the right, leading all the way back down to the South Bay area, which at that point was still an navigable waterway. Here you see a close-up of Fan Pier with the array of tracks leading to the warehouses and piers. In this photograph around the turn of the century, you can see a ship docked at Pier 1 of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad Freight Terminal. This is where Fort Point Channel joins Boston Harbor. In this 1919 Bromley Fan Pier map, you can see many more tracks in the area, both on Fan Pier and also south of there. You can notice there is Pier 1, Pier 2, and Pier 4. There is no Pier 3. Connecting downtown Boston and Fan Pier is the Northern Avenue Bridge, which is a swing bridge that spans Fort Point Channel and connects this area with downtown. It was built in 1908 and it closed to vehicular traffic in 1997 and operated as a pedestrian bridge until December of 2014, when it was closed after inspectors found that 13 floor beams were unsafe for pedestrians. At this time, the bridge is locked in the open position because there was concern that the bridge would not be able to open reliably and allow boats to pass. At this point, there are plans for a replacement bridge. The designs are still under consideration. Here in 1926, you see Fan Pier with the array of tracks and the boxcars. At this time, individual items were unloaded. This predates any kind of containerization. This 1930s aerial photograph shows Fan Pier and the financial district in the distance. The rail yard served Boston's working port until about 1955, when heavy industry dried up and the port moved to Charlestown. It spent most of the latter half of the 20th century as a vast wasteland of parking lots and abandoned wharfs. Here in this photograph in 1982, you can see one of the few draws of the area was Anthony's Pier 4 restaurant, which opened in 1963. In the 60s and 70s, there were very few other things that drew people to the area, mainly fishing piers and a few bars. Most of the area had parking lots which people who work downtown would use. In 1998, there was some redevelopment that had started on Fan Pier. To the right, you can see the federal courthouse, which was the first new structure built as Fan Pier became redeveloped. In this photograph, also on the left side, you see the white tent of Harbor Lights, a performance venue, which moved further down the street in 1999. Here in 2006 view, you can see the new Institute for Contemporary Art, which was built and opened earlier that year. And Anthony's Pier 4 is still there, but it closed in 2013. Here is Fan Pier at the current time. There is one building here, Mass Mutual, which is just finishing construction, but the other buildings are all finished. Here is Pier 4, where Anthony's Restaurant was, and over to the far right is one of the Fan Pier parks, which has a tidal well constructed within the footprint of the boat slip that once served Pier 1 and Pier 2. The original boat slip was filled in years ago, and this is a recreation that represents the 1870 seawall, which still defines much of the waterfront today. At the tidal well, you can see the water level change with the tides as granite blocks are set at 2-foot intervals. The twice daily average 10-foot tidal range can be witnessed against this backdrop. Pumped seawater cascades down the step seawall. Here we see a contemporary view of Fan Pier with the federal courthouse being the prominent feature. This is a view from the end of Long Wharf. So Fan Pier has been reimagined from a railroad served port area to a new complete neighborhood convenient to downtown after a period of abandonment. we welcome you to explore this area. I'll now turn it over to Steve Landrigan.
Thanks very much, Mark. That was fascinating. And I'm so glad that we'll be getting messages from people who are watching it. It is something very sweet about knowing that you're all out there. And what you're learning is that some of us know more about the harbor than we do about how to operate computers. We'll get there. My favorite part of the Harborwalk, what I'm going to talk about tonight, is the causeway that goes from City Point out to Castle Island. I'm there a lot and I know it pretty well. So you can imagine my surprise when I found this old postcard with a picture showing the head house, City Point, South Boston, Mass. I'd never heard of it. But it turns out that more than 50 years, from 1887 to 1942, this remarkable building stood pretty much in the spot where I usually park. There's absolutely no sign of it now. The head house, I've since learned, came out of a initiative in the 1880s. Wait a minute, something's not turning here in my computer. Why am I not getting my next slide? Oh, there we go, sorry. I was saying the head house came out of an initiative in the 1870s to build parks and neighborhoods across the city to provide basically open space for working people. In South Boston, the City Point Park was chosen as a location. City Point was chosen as a location for the new park. Land was to be filled in, mudflats got turned into beaches. It was all to be laid out by Frederick Law Olmsted, and it was going to be called Marine Park. Marine Park's central feature was this head house. Its primary purpose was a bathhouse where people who come in to swim could change, but it also had an ice cream parlor and retiring rooms for the ladies, as well as a large restaurant where a German band played on weekends from a balcony. People sang along. It was very much intended to be a destination for families. And I can't help but mention, look what people are wearing. They come to the beach and it's kind of like they're showing off yard goods. Maybe you know the name Thomas O'Connor. He's a historian who grew up in South Boston. He's written about that thousands of families from all over the Boston area came to Marine Park on open air trolleys. They would come loaded with blankets, bathing suits, huge box lunches. And in this old postcard from 1910, you can see one of those trolleys ambling along. And also look at the head house, and off to the right behind it, you see a pier. That is what gave the head house its name. A head house, it turns out, is an architectural term for a building at the head of a wharf or a mine or a railway station. And this head house was at the head of this pier, which in the days before air conditioning gave people a chance to come and catch a cool breeze in hot weather. And you see the wooden canopy. Under that were benches lining both sides of the pier. People could sit and stay a while. And the Marine Park beaches were immensely popular, especially on weekends. A Monday headline in a Boston Globe in July 1910 reported, record South Boston crowd, fully 150,000 visitors at City Point. This is at a time when the population of South Boston was only 70,000. The story goes on that from 7 to 10 p.m., there were 10,000 people on Farragut Road, on East 6th Street, and in the Marine Park, waiting for a chance to get on a streetcar. Sounds a little bit like the red line on rush hour, doesn't it? Yeah, bear in mind that all these people were crowded into a very small beach. Olmsted had wanted Castle Island to be incorporated into the park, as you can see in this design, which is the center picture here. And the map on the left shows you that the island in 1880 was a mile offshore. But by connecting the mainland to the island, Olmsted saw how he could triple the amount of beach space, and in the process create what he named Pleasure Bay, though if you ask anybody in South Boston, they'll tell you it's called the Lagoon. It took half a century for Olmsted's plan to be realized. So there was incremental filling all this time, but it was a very slow process. A lot of issues related around access to Castle Island, which was federal property for a very long time. So to compensate, a wooden footbridge, as you can see in this postcard on the right, opened in 1892 as a temporary solution, but temporary though it was, it stood there for 35 years. In this 1925 photograph, you can see that enough fill had been dredged from Pleasure Bay to make a dirt road all the way to Castle Island, but it would still be another 3 years before that was paved. If you look closely where I've highlighted the photo in yellow, you can make out the wooden footbridge still running along the edge of the newly made shoreline. And you Harbor Island folks, if you look in the upper right, just off the head house pier, you can see a very flat spectacle island. Eventually, Castle Island would become the focal point of Marine Park, much as Olmsted intended, especially after Pleasure Bay was encircled completely by a dike in 1959. But when this photo was taken, the head house was still the main attraction. The head house sprang from the fertile imagination of a Boston architect named Edmond Wheelwright. He based many of his designs on European buildings, but then put them to very different uses than their originals. For instance, this 14th century Italian tower was built for the fire department. A Flemish Renaissance guild hall in Cambridge became the offices of the Harvard Lampoon. Small Roman temples became the entrances to the Park Street subway station. A chateau from the Loire Valley turned up as a carriage house in Brookline. And the Longfellow Bridge over the Charles is an amalgam of bridges he studied on a trip to France, Germany, Austria, and Russia just before he designed that. So when Wheelwright visited the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 and saw the German pavilion, you can almost hear himself saying to himself, I want to build one of them. At the time, he was the Boston city architect and recently had been handed the assignment of creating a bathhouse for the new Marine Park. So I have to believe that when he saw how impressive this recreation of a German town hall looked on the shore of Lake Michigan, he immediately thought, bathhouse. But he didn't just copy what he saw. He captured various elements like the half timbering, the gables, the central tower, and to a certain extent the massing. But he added many flourishes of his own, such as this imposing main door. He gone to the three arches leading to the recessed entry. Instead, he created something far more fortress-like. As I look at this elevation that he drew of the facade of the head house, I can almost feel the pleasure that he took as he imagined this building rising next to the sea. But magnificent as it was, nothing lasts forever. Once the Great Depression hit, the city no longer had the funds to maintain it. And this 1935 photo shows how the flagpole has gone askew and an upper window is slid open, even though it's obviously winter. 3 years later, in 1938, a hurricane tore off part of the roof and destroyed the pier out back. Neither was ever repaired. By 1942, the head house had deteriorated so badly that it did not even open for the summer season. Then on December 5th of that year, disaster struck. In the early morning hours, a 2-alarm fire ripped through the head house, thought to be arson. 3 months later, what you see here was bulldozed. And a very magical half century at City Point came to a sad end. Its passing, however, attracted minimal notice, probably because only a week before the head house burned, a fire at the Coconut Grove restaurant had killed 492 people, and Boston was still reeling from that. The head house was gone before I was born, but I find myself wishing it was still there. I love this photo from when it was newly built. There's a horse-drawn wagon out in front, Castle Islands across the water behind the flagpole. A website called Boston Zest has a page of photos of the head house where the question is raised, is it possible to grieve for something that you have never seen or known? Well, in this case, the answer, at least for me, is a resounding yes. And now on to my friend Laurie Zapalak, who is standing by waiting to take us to Port Norfolk in Dorchester. Laurie?
Thank you. That was fascinating and somewhat sad.
Sorry.
What a beautiful building. We're gonna end tonight, as all good tours should, with ice cream and whiskey in the small neighborhood of Port Norfolk. And let me just get my slides. Located at the mouth of the Neponset River in the southeast corner of Dorchester. The neighborhood today includes Tinian Beach, located here, just a few streets lined with 19th century 1- and 2-family houses, Port Norfolk Yacht Club, as well as the remains of a complex of late 19th, early 20th century industrial buildings, along with Joseph Finnegan Park, a 14-acre waterfront park completed in 2016 on the site that was once home to the Schaefer Paper Company. Sections of the Harborwalk are included in this neighborhood, and you can see them here along Tinian Beach and a little section here just abutting the yacht club, and then through the park. So they're not contiguous, but they are present. And then what's really cool is that from this neighborhood, you can also link up with the Neponset River Greenway Trail and continue some 8 miles up the river through Pope John Paul II Park, the Neponset Marshes to the Lower Mills area and beyond. And Port Norfolk is somewhat of a secret today because you have to be intentional about getting there. Over time, it has been effectively cut off from the rest of Dorchester, first by the Old Colony Railroad, which the red line follows today, that right of way. And then second, and more critically, by the construction of the Southeast Parkway between 1954 and 1959. And this separation, in effect, has protected the neighborhood from larger residential and commercial development. And as we look at this map from 1831, what we see is that prior to the arrival of the railroad, much of the land in the vicinity was marshland. It was used for grazing and harvesting of salt hay by Dorchester settlers, but really little development had taken place. And this is the peninsula of which we are speaking. But the site, together with Commercial Point here and Squantum Point on the Quincy side of the river, are typical of river confluence sites. They are vulnerable to natural forces, but also strategic for defense and economic reasons. Concurrent with the arrival of the railroad, the town of Dorchester, which wasn't annexed to Boston until 1870, acquired the land, which was known at that time as Pine Neck. And soon after, the first lumber yard was established there, followed by investment from the Neponset Wharf Company, chartered in 1848, which aimed to develop the neck and its waterfront with docks and wharves and buildings. They laid out streets and building lots, and soon houses were constructed. And this village became an important commercial port with 2 large lumber companies that were, and those companies owned many of the houses in which the workmen lived within the neighborhood. And about this time, Pratt's Wharf was also developed as a center of activity for the flounder fleet, try to say that frequently, which is located about right here. It was in 1859 that Silas Putman established the Putman Nail Company at Pine Point, just out on the very tip of the peninsula. And this area became a true center of industry. Silas Putman, one of his inventions, and for which this site is best known, includes automating the manufacture of hot forged horse nails. And what is interesting is that he supplied these nails both to the Union and the Confederacy during the Civil War. By 1855, the Nail Works was Dorchester's largest employer, employing about 100 men. And by 1872, pardon me, that was 1865. And by 1872, that number had doubled. And just as celebrity athletes advertise shoes today, in Putman's time, it was the image of some of the most celebrated horses in the world that helped him to sell his wares. Putman's Nail Works closed not long after the start of the 20th century. And in 1910, the property was purchased by renowned yacht company George Lawley and Son. Originally, it was established in 1851 in East Boston, but the firm moved several times before taking over the Putman site and was in business here until 1945. The firm is known in part for the range of vessels that it built. No less than 8 yachts for America's Cup races, as well as torpedo boats in World War I and World War II minesweepers. Lawley's Basin, as the area came to be known, grew into a massive operation, again, partially linked to wartime economics. By 1929, over 450 men were employed in more than 22 separate departments in the shipyard. And this is the Guinevere, the first sailing yacht fitted with diesel oil engines, which was built in 1921. Interestingly, it was requisitioned by the War Shipping Administration at the outbreak of World War II. And this beautiful vessel, or part of it, is the Whirlwind, built for the 1930s America's Cup race. Even as these industries grew, the neighborhood's waterfront resources were used recreationally, just as they are today. The image at top of the group gathered on Tinian Beach in 1910 conveys the appreciation that Dorchester residents have long had for this little spit of sand. And note the sailboat in the background, probably fabricated by Lawley and Son. Some 100 years later, the ritual event of the Brian Leahy Memorial Polar Plunge represents a continued connection between residents and this site. And this painting of Tinian Beach, which shows beachgoers juxtaposed happily against the backdrops of industrial waterfront buildings, also captures the spirit, I think. Lawley and Son ceased operation at the end of World War II. The lumber yards and other activities continued until the 1960s. And as many who lived in Port Norfolk were also employed by shipyard industries, the entire neighborhood went into decline and many industrial buildings were eventually demolished, which partially explains the number of parking lots that you see here at the end of the peninsula today. But some entrepreneurs have found new ways to be productive in the waterfront complex. And interventions such as the Joseph Finnegan Park have been instrumental in environmental remediation and restoring access to the waterfront, along with helping Boston be more climate ready. Seymour, or Buddy Seymourian, founder of Seymour's Ice Cream, is one such entrepreneur to make use of this site. It is to him that we owe a debt of gratitude for the invention of the Nutty Buddy ice cream cone. Seymour's Ice Cream ceased operation in the 1980s, but the Nutty Buddy lives on. Another entity, whoops, I don't know what happened to that slide, but I think you'll get the picture, that seized an opportunity here is Vanessa Restaurant, a family-run restaurant and event venue that has now operated on Pine Point for more than 25 years. Interestingly, as part of Article 65, establishing the Dorchester neighborhood zoning district, this entire area is now zoned for waterfront services with the goal of preserving elements of a working waterfront. Today, the most well-known and perhaps not so secret entrepreneurial affiliation with Port Norfolk is Boston Harbor Distillery, founded by Rhonda Coleman to make whole grain whiskey and other inventive spirits, shown here with barman and spirit consultant, wouldn't I like to have that job, Corey Bunwith. In 2015, the Boston Harbor Distillery opened on this site in a building constructed as part of the original Putman Nail Complex. Built in 1859 with Douglas fir post and beam construction, it includes 40-foot high ceilings and more than 100 windows, just really a beautiful space. Boston Harbor Distillery follows in the footsteps of the entrepreneurs that preceded them, noting that they have been inspired to carry on their legacy by redefining American spirits. From products such as Putman's New England whiskey and Seymour's Boston cream rum, as well as their inventive yet firmly rooted cocktail recipes such as the Nutty Buddy, we experience a great example of heritage, honoring that and those which have come before us and that which has been passed on by prior generations, but making use of it in new and inventive ways. And I say cheers to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori and Steve and Mark and Jan and Liz and Sarah. If everyone wants to turn their cameras and microphones back on, we've got a few questions coming in and just a couple minutes to answer them before we wrap up tonight. One of the questions in the Q&A is about whether there was a rail connection between South Station and Fan Pier, and then between the Mystic and North Station, and Mark's going to take that one.
Okay, I can answer that. As far as South Station area and Fan Pier, I can show a map. I was on the map I had shown before. Can I share my screen now?
Go for it.
Okay. So here on this map, in the top center to the left of Congress Street is tracks going from Fan Pier over to the South Station area. Now this is before the South Union Terminal, or the current South Station, was actually created. And those tracks were gone by the time you look at 1919. So there was a connection, but that had to be severed in order for them to put in South Station, which is shown here on the right side. You can see South Station's over there. But at that point, the tracks coming across Fort Point Channel were removed. I don't know of any connections between North Station and the Charlestown area, except going all the way around through the neck at some point. I don't have a map of that, but I think Sarah's maps showed some of that.
Okay, well, let's see. There was a train, there was the elevated that went from North Station to Sullivan Square down Main Street.
You have the rail yards too, I think, in one of your maps.
Okay, hold on here. So the question was about, was there a direct connection between
North Station and, yeah, North Station and
Mystic and North Station. I think the closest thing is just, even the Orange Line today connects places along the Mystic River to North Station. And it was previously an elevated rail. So
yeah, I think most of the rail lines were used for.
But the freight lines that went into the Charlestown area came around through Sullivan Square.
Yeah. Great. I just want to note for Peter Sutton about major developments in terms of the new Northern Avenue Bridge. So building on Mark's reference to the history of it, I think you're going to have to ask the city and not the Friends of the Harborwalk for the future of that bridge.
Right. And the latest information that I've seen, they've sort of stalled on moving forward with the actual design, the final decision on that. But I've gone to some of the presentations where they showed a number of different designs for a replacement bridge.
Yep. Anne asks about the Lolly's Shipyard at Port Norfolk. It sounds like she's been unable to locate records of the shipyard's work in the 40s and wanted suggestions for where to find those documents. Lori, where would you recommend that she look?
That's a great question. This might be too general of a response, but I'm sure many of you all know of Digital Commonwealth as a great place to start looking because of the fact that it aggregates digitized resources from archives and museums across the Commonwealth. So I would begin there if you haven't already, and I'll think if anything else more specific comes to mind, I'll get it out there.
Great.
And I'm just going to pick up, and somebody in the chat mentioned that before it was Vanessa Restaurant, it was Harbor Lights. So let's add that too.
Excellent. And do you know who did the painting of Tenian Beach?
That's a great question. I have actually been looking for that. It is from the Dorchester Athenaeum blog. If anyone does know, it's unsighted, and what I saw, I'd love to know. I think it's
great.
Beautiful.
I'm also going to add to the chat that Jen Merkel has shared some information about Edmond Wheelwright's architectural styles and a link. So I'm going to put that in the chat so Steve can review it. And Steve, if you have an answer based on this.
I would like to know more about him. We see his stuff all over town, but I cannot find a biography of him. He didn't seem to write very much. He died rather young. He had a nervous breakdown from overwork, it was thought. Spent the last 2 years of his life in a sanitarium in Thompsonville, Connecticut, and then died at age 54. But look what all he produced. He's one of the, unlike Bullfinch or H.H. Richardson, he didn't make everything in a consistent style. So it's hard to look at a building and say, oh, there's a wheelwright. But once you begin to understand how his mind worked, you begin to spot it. Is actually his greatest contribution to Boston was in public schools. And he did write a book about that, the building of public schools. I wish I knew more. If anybody knows any more about him, I'd love to hear.
Great. People also want to know where your background is, Steve.
My background? How much time you got? I'm from Boston.
No, sorry. That's your Zoom background.
Oh, my Zoom background.
Also, yeah, I mean, I love your background.
I thought
the Zoom background, you can do this. You can project a picture behind you from something inside your computer. And this is the site of the head house as it appears today. It's an octagonal gazebo at the beginning of the walkway out to Castle Island. You can't see it in this photo, but just off to the right is a monument to World War II veterans from South Boston.
Awesome, thank you. Someone thought it was Pierce Park in Eastie, which is what I would have guessed if I had
okay, no, similar, but not the same.
Gambling on it, yeah. Jan, your park is based on the fact that people once needed to sail into South Bay. So there are two questions about South Bay. Do you know when it was filled in, and just how far did the South Bay extend? Did it go past the South Bay Shopping Center? Expressway?
Yes. South Bay is very interesting. So to answer the first question, it started to be filled in more completely after World War I, and wasn't completely filled in until the 1960s. The Southeast Expressway contributed a lot to that. And it went in, that little yellow thing that I showed you was called the Roxbury Canal, which went into, sort of ended near the area or a little bit past the area where Mass Ave, if you know where the Mass Ave connector gets off the central artery and goes to Mass Ave, a little bit beyond that. And there was actually a little town dock of Roxbury when it was a separate town. So that was actually Roxbury's harbor, as well as Dorchester on the other end. South Bay is a fascinating little piece of body of water that very few people know much about.
Thank you. I'm really cognizant of the time and want to note that we've gone over 8 o'clock. It was supposed to be a 1-hour tour, but I am deeply grateful for the 6 friends of the members of the Friends of the Boston Harbor Walk. And I want to share 2 links with you. The first one is that you can watch this webinar and other past webinars that they've been putting together over the past year at bostonharbornow.org/friends. You can learn more about how to get involved, attend monthly meetings, sign up to volunteer with this great group. And if you want to learn more specifically about the signage initiative, which is led by Liz, I've just added that to the chat as well. We can stick around for another 5 minutes or so to answer questions if people still have them, but I also want to make space for people who have other things that they're getting to tonight, whether that's a late dinner or putting the kids to bed or just being done with your computer for the night. So we'll stick around, but I wanted to say an official thank you and goodbye to people who need to take off. 2 questions that are still remaining if someone wants to start with one of them. There was a question about a longshoreman strike in 1970 or 72 that shut down the waterfront. Mark, I don't know if you know how that affected this area.
Well, that was already beyond the time of Fan Pier. So 1955, basically the railroad operations shut down there. So I don't know. I assume that would affect the Charlestown port area. And of course, containerized shipping really just changed the whole way shipping is done. We now have the CSX terminal out toward Worcester, where they take trailers off railroad flat cars now, and that's the big big terminal out there
Great.
as far as rail.
And then one more question, is the Domino Sugar Factory in use? And if so, what is it used for? I think, Sarah, you answered that in the chat to the questioner, but maybe you can tell everyone about that.
Yeah, and hi to Kathia. Let's see, it's the yellow brick building on Medford Street. I believe the dog park runs right by it, but 425 Medford, and it's just an R&D building these days. But the Harborwalk restarts right around there, so you can get a better glimpse of it from the connection from Medford Street to the Harborwalk that runs slightly south of the Strauss building.
Great.
And there are railroad tracks there you have to cross actually to get to the Harborwalk there. That's part of the
rails to
remnants
Charles.
of the rail that used to go.
Great. And there's one final question that just asks, does anyone do small group walks of some of these areas? And the answer is, in non-COVID times, these are the folks who give the walking tours. So we hope that you will stay tuned and plugged into the work of this incredible group of volunteers. They will be giving more tours when it is safe to do so. So stay tuned. You'll probably get a couple more webinars, and at some point in the future, with more vaccinations, we'll be in a place where we can take you back out on the water physically and not just digitally. So with that, thank you all and have a great night.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Good night,
Bye.
everyone.
Good
Thank you for
night.
tuning in.
Good night.
Bye.